I think your book is so timely, and you obviously were working on it before everything that happened with George Floyd and nationwide. It's called 5 Days, and it's about the 5 days at the center of the Freddie Gray protests. Obviously, you're in Baltimore right now. You're from Baltimore, and so the city's near and dear to your heart. How did you experience those protests in real time? And then how did this book come about?
I remember the whole thing kind of began when I was sitting in Freddie Gray's funeral. And for those who might not remember, Freddie Gray was a 25-year-old young man in Baltimore who made eye contact with police and ran. The reason I say that is because that was his crime. Was if you are in a high crime, oftentimes high poverty area, making eye contact with police and running is enough to trigger probable cause. Had he done that in a wealthy neighborhood, he would have been going for a jog. But he makes eye contact with police and runs in Harlem Park, Sandtown, Winchester, which are two areas of Baltimore, West Baltimore, of deep poverty. And he's arrested. An hour after he's arrested, he's in a coma. And when he's finally taken to the University of Maryland Medical Center, it is deemed that he has 3 broken vertebrae and a crushed voice box and a crushed larynx. And so there were protests that took place in Baltimore for 2 weeks after, demanding justice and accountability, saying, how is someone arrested and an hour later they're in a coma? And no one has an answer for what happened. And the morning of his funeral, I went to the funeral, and Andrew, was crazy because I remember sitting in the back of the church, and I didn't feel like I had earned the right to make that walk up to go view the body. So I just sat in the back. And I left the funeral, and I had to fly to Boston to give a talk on poverty. And the irony of that hit me really hard. That the night of his funeral was the night that Baltimore started this process, and that's when you saw the unrest take place, literally to the point that by 6 o'clock that night, the governor had called in the National Guard and put Baltimore under a state of emergency and a curfew. And I found myself in Boston talking about poverty, both because of the work that I was doing, because at that point I was running an organization that I founded that focused on helping students, generally first generation students, make it and stay in college. But I also knew that they were there to kind of talk about my past and my background and put me up as an example. And it was in that moment that I started realizing how dangerous that was, how it made me complicit as well.
Wow.
That we can sit there and say and look at the people who make it and say it's because of them and it's such a great story, and then look at ones who don't and say it's because of them and it's because they didn't work hard, without understanding the systems that we still have in place.
Well, that's what your book, The Other Wes Moore, is all about.
That's exactly right. Right?
It's about the same neighborhood, and one winds up here and then the other winds up in jail.
That's right. And how we are so quick as a society to either congratulate or to castigate without being willing to understand or indict systems that we have in all of this. And I think about this in context. And, earlier on this week, we had the current governor of Maryland, he announced that he's putting out a book, right? And in the book, he starts talking a lot about this moment, and he was the brand new governor. I think he was governor for 3 months at the time when everything jumped off with Freddie Gray. But during this book, he spends time, and the exact quote that he used when he was describing Freddie Gray was, he called him a Crips gang-connected, street-level drug dealer with a long criminal rap sheet. I spent 4 years focusing on and understanding what happened around Freddie Gray and what happened in Baltimore around those times. And here's what I do know. And I can say this definitively, that the story of Freddie Gray's life is a story of societal failure. Because this was a young man who was born underweight and premature. He was also born addicted to heroin because his mother battled heroin addiction for much of her life. She grew up in deep poverty her entire life. She gives birth to twins. Once the twins are old enough that they actually gain enough weight that they're able to leave the hospital, they move into a housing project on North Carey Street over in West Baltimore. And that housing project in 2009, along with 480 other homes, were actually cited in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead inside of that house. You know, and you know, Andrew, it's like, you know, the CDC, right? The Center for Disease Control indicates that if a person has 6 milliliters of lead in every deciliter of blood, that person will have cognitive damages for the remainder of their life, right? We've known this as a neurotoxin for a century. If a person has 6, Freddie Gray had 36. So this was a young man who was born premature, underweight, addicted to heroin, and lead poisoned. And by that time in his life, he's 2. And so when we're making these judgments about people, by the time he was in 5th grade, he was 4 grade levels behind in reading because of the cognitive damage of the lead poisoning. You know, he finished his last recorded day of school in the Baltimore City school system was in 10th grade, and he was 19 years old. He had been in special education classes his entire academic career because of the lead poisoning. And so when I'm hearing this, where you know, hearing the current governor making points about how, well, you know, he was no choir boy, he was no singer in the church choir. I know he wasn't, but I also know this is that Freddie Gray never had a shot. Freddie Gray never had a chance, and that was the point of all of this, is that we have to understand all of these moments and all these periods. We have got to understand it with a sense of context, because the truth is that every system that touched Freddie's life, whether it was the health system or the housing system or our education system or our policing system, that it not only failed to help him, but it did severe and lasting damage. And now we see the product of that.
Yeah, and he dies in police custody after an hour. I mean, like that's like the brutal end, you know, to a story of institutional failure.
That's,
you know,
exactly right.
And the tough part of it is that, like, if you have a set of systems or an economy that's grinding people up, and then someone dies as a result, it's almost like a reflex to say, well, what was wrong with this person? You know, yes. Because that's actually a more comforting stance and narrative than to say, like, wait a minute, like, maybe we've had problems up and down for years and decades and generations, or even the fact that in his case, I mean, you know, he's born to a mother who's addicted to heroin. I mean, you could probably trace some problems even before he's born. To various failures. And this is something, so the book, one of the things in the book that struck me was there's a woman, I believe her name is Tawanda Jones.
Yeah.
And she's protesting, like, I believe it was her brother or like someone else who was a victim of police violence. And so she's holding like weekly protests before Freddie dies. And then the Freddie Gray protests end up getting built into like a pre-existing, and this struck me forcibly because you're like, wow, there's like a constant sort of waterfall of impacted families and protests that pre-exist any one person, where everyone's looking around being like, who are you protesting? Because they had like different family members who'd been victimized. So that was one thing where I was like, wow, like if you're in that environment, like that is mind-blowing for most.
I'm telling you, Andrew, one of the most fascinating things for me about the project of writing 5 days was first identifying who were the people that I wanted to follow over this 5-day period, and that I wanted the reader to be able to walk through this era, walk through this chaos through their eyes, through the eyes of these people. And one of the first people I knew that I was like, I got to make sure she's profiled is Tawanda Jones. And because it's important to remember that even in the 2 years before Freddie Gray, right, there was Chris Brown, there was Anthony Anderson, and there was her brother, Tyrone West. And every Wednesday, still to this day, in fact, she just had the 371st straight West Wednesday, where every Wednesday she protests. Sometimes it's just her and maybe one other person, and sometimes she's got hundreds of people with her. But rain, sleet, snow, doesn't matter. She protests. And she protests the fact that even prior to all this, where she was, and she found herself and I was having these amazing conversations with her where she would say, I was so proud to march with the Gray family when they called me and asked me. And I was so proud of the fact that the city was standing up and saying, yes, we want justice. And yes, we have to address policing. But she said, but I just also felt a certain type of way where I still thought to myself, but where was this when my brother was killed? Right? Where was this when my brother's body was literally left in the middle of the street with mace all over him and boot prints all over his body? Where was this? And so every Wednesday, she protests, demanding justice and accountability for what happened to her brother. And she was such a fascinating person to follow over that 5-day period, especially when you look at it in context of who some of the other people were, right? So you had Tawanda, but then I also, spent time following Major Mark Partee, who was a Baltimore City police major who grew up in West Baltimore. And I remember him specifically telling me before where he said, listen, I know that none of my colleagues woke up that morning with homicide in their mind. But I also know that for kids in West Baltimore, where I grew up, I know why they don't believe me. Right? Or following someone like Greg Butler, who's a basketball star turned protester, or following someone like John Angelos, who's a son of the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, literally, a billionaire, who was also the head of baseball operations for the Orioles. And on the Wednesday after, baseball played its first ever game with no fans. Now we're doing it all the time. But their first ever game with no fans when the Orioles played the Chicago White Sox. And it was because John Angelos was one of the people in the room making the final decision of basically saying, no, we should play the game even though the city is in a state of emergency because the world needs to see this. And so watching the various and different perspectives of people like that, people like a Nick Mosby, who's a city councilman at the time, whose wife was the state's attorney in Baltimore, but watching it through their eyes, I think, hopefully provided a real kaleidoscope understanding of the complexity of the moment, but also that if we thought that this was just about policing or just about Freddie, that we were missing a bigger point, that society was trying to tell us something else that they were hoping that we would actually pay attention to.
Well, there was another fact in the Tawanda Jones narrative that also hit me really hard, which was that, and I'm not sure if it was for her brother or for another victim, but they essentially settled for $1 million and gave it to the 3 survivors of the victim of police brutality. And that struck me because it was a situation where it's like, well, you clearly know that something went terribly wrong if you were settling with a family, but there's no no arrests made, no accountability. It's just like there's a death and then there's like some money. Yeah. And one of the things that I found when I was researching the extent of the problem of police misconduct was that actually happens all over the country, where they're settling these civil judgments to the tune of over $1 billion a year in the aggregate. And so that's their way of papering over this problem. And so if you think about like the number of times it happens and no one gets a dime, or the number of times it happens and someone sues and it's completely unsuccessful because can you imagine trying to sue your local police department? I mean, that sounds like very, very difficult to me, you feel like everything would be uphill. So the fact that you're still getting $1 billion under those conditions struck me as a sign that the problem is orders of magnitude bigger. Like if you had to try and throw a measurement on it, you were like, police are causing billions of dollars of bodily harm to Americans every single year. And the fact that was happening in Baltimore, where there's like no real responsibility, but here is some like blood money. Essentially, it's like, hey, we killed your dad, but here's a little bit of money. Like maybe that makes up for it. Like that also hit me really hard.
And honestly, and I think Tawanda's story is such a powerful one around it because she didn't take any money, and it was for that reason. Because they also knew that with taking the payment meant there was also essentially
an agreement to never talk about this again. Right?
And she's like, I'm not going to stop talking about it. So she never took any money for it. Wow. But and you bring up an incredibly important point, because there is this narrative about Baltimore when people say, so what brought the temperature down? What calmed everything down in Baltimore? And oftentimes the narrative is, well, it was when the National Guard were called in, right? That's not true. Because, first of all, I can tell you as a person who, very proudly wore the uniform, oftentimes when you introduce military personnel into situations, that doesn't calm situations down, right? But the second thing and the most important thing to remember is some of the biggest protests that were going to take place in Baltimore were actually set to take place the Saturday after the unrest. What happened, why those protests never happened, wasn't because the National Guard was there. The National Guard was already there when they were being planned. What happened was when the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, announced she was pressing charges against the 6 officers. Because up until that point, you're absolutely right, Andrew, it's like the thread was common, right? Something happened, a payout ensued, and it went away. That was the general trend, right? But this was the first time in Baltimore history where the state's attorney was actually saying, no, I'm actually pressing charges against these officers for misconduct. I remember being there, Andrew, where there was almost this celebratory vibe throughout the streets of Baltimore because people were shocked. People were like, wait, she announced what? That they're arresting the officers for that? Because we had never seen that before. And now, granted, fast forward, we had 2 of the officers were found not guilty. 4 of the officers their charges were dismissed. But that moment, that was what brought the temperature down, because people thought for the first time we actually might see justice. And what's interesting now, I think, even when you look at what's happened with George Floyd, one of the big differences I think between then and now is the bar has been risen. Where at that point, the charges were like, whoa, that's a big deal, calm everything down. Now, charges have been filed. The bar isn't about charges anymore. The bar is convictions. And that's going to be the real test to see, can you actually get convictions for these instances? In the case of George Floyd, when you are literally watching a grown man in handcuffs on the ground, with another man nonchalantly leaning his knee into his neck until he can no longer breathe. I mean, the bar is not, can we get an arrest? The bar is conviction for that.
Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.